of Management Studies IGNOU presents an audiobook on the course Mmpc 017 Advanced Strategic Management for MBA program. Presenting Block 4 Strategic Enablers, Unit 10 Technology and R&D Part 2.
Development of R&D strategy. One standard definition of R&D states that research is an undirected basic science or a directed or applied science where development in research can result in innovative products and processes from either of these sources. Research differs from development of a product in that it is an exploration of ideas rather than a tangible output to be marketed. There is no guarantee that a new idea will be successful. R&D must provide a high degree of insurance so that future gaps can be closed to meet corporate goals such as profitability. Therefore, many innovations are necessary and should be allowed to flourish to assure the achievement of these goals. Invention is an idea that must be converted to practice, that is, one must show that the technical idea is feasible and can be demonstrated. The payoff of a timely invention can make a firm gain a market edge by lowering price even with the strategy that places it below production cost. The belief is that increased sales would ensure future cost reductions from increased volume of output due to increased sales. The selection of R&D projects is the most important of all the R&D management activities. Unless an R&D department is working on the right R&D projects, all its efforts should come to zero. Consequently, most R&D organizations spend a great deal of time trying to select the right projects. What is rarely seen in these efforts to select the right R&D projects, however, is the value of having an overall R&D strategy before selecting R&D projects. A R&D strategy is important because it helps a R&D organization select projects in terms of a broader outlook rather than just bit by bit. When a R&D department has an overall strategy and has some strategic goals, it will more likely select projects that are in tune with its technical strengths, the capabilities of the company, and the demands of the marketplace. In order to develop a sound R&D strategy, certain prerequisites must be in place. Preconditions for effective development of an R&D strategy. In order to develop a R&D strategy, a R&D organization first must make sure that certain conditions are in place. There are 7 prerequisites for developing a R&D strategy. First, a belief that a R&D strategy can solve problems. Second, creation of a planning staff within a large R&D department or the establishment of a strong commitment by the R&D line managers in a small R&D organization to devote enough efforts to doing R&D strategic planning. Third, a method of linking R&D strategic planning to R&D operations. Fourth, a mode of getting strategic marketing done. Fifth, the active support from senior management. Sixth, prior efforts to develop a R&D strategy. Seventh, a series of substantial and solid efforts that produce tangible results on their own but allow R&D people to get better at R&D strategic planning. Steps involved in developing R&D strategy. First, believe that R&D strategy solves problems. Although the idea of developing a R&D strategy may be accepted, usually development of an R&D strategy will not come about unless a R&D strategy is used for solving a problem, which means the effort that goes into developing a R&D and the conflicts that may occur about how R&D resources should be allocated are so great that unless a R&D organization has a clear R&D strategy, it really will make the effort or face the conflicts. On the whole, R&D organizations require a strategy when they wish to use new technologies for future products. If, on the other hand, a R&D organization relies solely on utilizing existing technology to develop new products, then it may not need a R&D strategy. Usually, R&D managers recognize that a R&D strategy will help them when they have doubts about how R&D resources are being used. For instance, the R&D manager of a FMCG company perceived the need for R&D strategy when they were forced to consolidate all R&D on coffee that previously was carried out in several laboratories. To accomplish this task, they recognized that they had to have a R&D strategy to prioritize and coordinate an all R&D being done on coffee. Later, they perceived the need to develop a R&D strategy related to R&D being done on beverages in a few laboratories. In short, although developing a R&D strategy is a nice idea, this idea will not be put into practice unless R&D managers perceive that a R&D strategy can solve a problem. Second, creating planning staff within a R&D organization. Creating a planning staff or establishing a strong commitment by the R&D managers in a small R&D organization to devote enough efforts to R&D strategic planning is necessary. Although line managers within a large R&D organization by themselves can develop a R&D strategy in practice, if there is no planning staff to facilitate the development of a R&D strategy, there will never be a R&D strategy. Although some companies have a R&D strategy, it was not easy to develop one. The R&D planners normally run into two types of problems: analytical and organizational problems. The analytical problems surface when the R&D planners first attempt to facilitate the development of a R&D strategy. They find that there is no accepted methodology for developing a R&D strategy. Although R&D managers in some companies, consultants, and academicians all had their opinions on what a R&D strategy should be and how it should be formulated, almost none of them have a complete picture of the process. In addition, the opinions of these various R&D managers, consultants, and academicians often were in conflict with each other or were irreconcilable. Thus, the R&D planners have to develop their own methodology. In addition, R&D planners also find that members of the R&D staff are generally not interested in developing a R&D strategy. Because of this, R&D planners have to spend majority of their time during the first few years persuading the R&D staff to do R&D strategic planning and then educating them with regard to how a R&D strategy can be developed. The experiences of these R&D planners are typical. Someone usually has to develop the methodology to be used in doing R&D strategic planning. Someone also has to be the champion of R&D strategic planning, or it will not get done. In theory, R&D managers in a large R&D organization can handle these responsibilities. In practice, R&D line managers in a large R&D organization normally have so many other responsibilities that they neglect R&D strategic planning. Thus, a R&D planning group usually proves to be necessary to getting R&D strategic planning done. In a small R&D organization, on the other hand, R&D line managers are the only ones who can develop an R&D strategy because staff positions rarely exist. Thus, to get R&D strategic planning done, the R&D line managers in a small R&D organization must add the responsibilities of an R&D planning group to their normal responsibilities. These R&D managers usually will not be able to devote much time to developing a planning methodology. On the other hand, because they have responsibility for managing the R&D groups, if the R&D managers in a small R&D organization do develop an R&D strategy, they should have less difficulty in getting this strategy accepted and implemented. The key to planning in either situation is that the doers, not the planners, must do the planning. The role of the planners is to facilitate the planning process, which is an important, although seldom appreciated role. Third, connecting R&D strategic planning to R&D operations. To get a R&D staff to develop a R&D strategy, R&D planners or R&D line managers have to find ways to relate R&D strategic planning to R&D operations. This connection between R&D strategic planning and R&D operations has two aspects. Members of the R&D staff have to be able to see that their interests are served through developing a R&D strategy. Thus, R&D planners must find a mechanism that involves R&D strategic planning and at the same time the R&D staff. One of the primary purposes of such forums is to get these R&D people to talk with each other. This cross-disciplinary forum can turn out to be a useful mechanism not only for improving communication but also for getting R&D strategic planning accepted. Once involved in interdisciplinary forum, these R&D people can get interested in technical activities as well. The R&D projects that are actually selected and the R&D strategy needs to be meaningful. In other words, a R&D strategy is not meaningful if it does not influence with R&D projects are selected and carried out. A R&D organization in a household products company addressed viewing the development of a R&D strategy as involving two phases. In the first phase, the senior R&D managers defined the overall direction of the R&D strategy. During the second phase, middle-level R&D managers defined the R&D strategy through the projects they selected and carried out. Fourth, linking R&D efforts strategy to customers' needs. Although it is important for a R&D organization to link its strategic operations, this is not enough. For a R&D organization's strategic plans, this strategic plan must be clearly linked to customer future needs. Therefore, besides doing R&D strategic planning, a R&D organization must also get marketing done in its company. Two of the hard questions that must be addressed in a strategic marketing are: first, who will the company's customers be in the future? Second, what will those customers need in the future? In answering these questions well, one must understand economic, regulatory, geographic, and social trends and opportunities. Now, fifth, active support of the senior management. To get its R&D strategy integrated with business plans, an R&D organization must have the active support of senior business managers. To gain the active support of senior business managers, an R&D organization must explain the value of R&D in business terms, for example, with regard to how R&D will help the company A. satisfy customers' needs, B. cut costs, C. expand into new markets, or D. minimize distribution problems. Those R&D organizations that have been able to gain the active support of senior business managers for their R&D strategy were helped by organizational factors. For example, in a chemical company, the R&D organization was able to gain the active support of senior business managers because the chief executive officer is one of the major proponents of R&D in the company. As opposed to most of the other senior business managers in this company, this chief executive previously managed the division of the company that sells to industrial customers. Because the customers of this division are more knowledgeable about what R&D can contribute, this CEO realized how valuable R&D can be and thus has not only supported R&D strategic planning but also has actually encouraged the R&D organization to do it. Sixth, in another company, a key factor that allowed the R&D organization to first gain and then maintain the support of senior business managers was leadership among senior business managers. Stability and continuity in leadership was important because it took a few years for the senior business managers of having a R&D strategy. By learning year after year what the R&D was trying to accomplish with a R&D strategy, the senior management was able to appreciate the benefits. The R&D department in turn could build progress that it had made with these senior business managers in previous years. The key to taking each of the steps discussed above is picking a problem that the R&D organization is facing that also calls for a more systematic analysis of the use of R&D resources. The value of carrying out a series of concrete steps is that together they serve as stepping stones to improve R&D strategic planning. Moreover, because they produce tangible results along the way, they also help elicit support for the R&D strategic planning process. Seventh, one way in which a R&D organization can maintain the vitality of planning process is through carrying out a series of concrete efforts that produce tangible results on their own but also allowed R&D people to improve planning expertise. A second method involves benchmarking studies in which the R&D people compare the strengths and weaknesses of their company's technologies in relation to the strengths and weaknesses of their competitors' technologies. The R&D people can gain two things through this effort. First, they gain a much better understanding of how their company stands in relation to competitors. And second, they learn how to analyze their technologies. For example, they learn how to think more precisely about how their technical work could improve the performance of the company's products. A third effort that the R&D organization can consider involves using the techniques of portfolio management to evaluate the potential and payoffs of various technologies. Progress of R&D organizations in strategy development. Few R&D organizations in India have a R&D strategy or have established the conditions required for developing a R&D strategy. For example, few R&D organizations have perceived a R&D strategy as a way to solve a problem. Many large R&D organizations do not have a R&D planning group, and organizations do not do R&D strategic planning. Also, few R&D organizations found a way to get strategic marketing done. Finally, in most companies, R&D strategic planning does not have the active support of senior management. In addition, if one looks closely at the strategic goals of those R&D that have them, one also finds that many of these goals were arrived analytically. That is, many of the strategic goals of such R&D organizations are intuitively obvious. For example, most of the strategic goals that organizations have formulated are similar and quite predictable. First, to ward out fundamental threats to the company's businesses. Second, to comply with government regulations. Few R&D organizations have conducted benchmarking their technologies to competitors' technologies. Few R&D organizations carry out technology forecasting studies aimed at understanding 1. What technological changes may be occurring in the next 5 to 10 years, and second, what those technological changes may mean. Even those R&D organizations that have made significant progress in an R&D strategy admit that they still have much to do to improve the planning process. For example, the R&D organization may have a R&D strategy, but the top management does not accept this R&D strategy. Many R&D departments develop a R&D strategy, but they do not find a way to integrate their R&D strategy with the marketing and manufacturing strategies in the company. In addition, the R&D strategy can be altered at the whim of anyone who at a later date becomes involved in the planning process without necessarily informing anyone else about the changes in the plans. In summary, some R&D organizations have made significant progress in developing an R&D strategy. Most R&D organizations, however, have barely started developing an R&D strategy. The immediate challenge facing most R&D organizations, therefore, has to do with first establishing the preconditions required for developing an R&D strategy. After doing this, they will then be able to meaningfully deal with issues as to what the R&D priorities should be and how R&D resources should be allocated. Summary. An essential component of competitive strategy is recognizing the role that R&D plays in the competitive success of a firm and acting to ensure that technology decisions and policies contribute to the firm's competitive advantage. A firm which has a strong R&D program can influence all these factors positively and contribute to the competitive advantage of a firm. Competitive advantage views R&D activities as a way of improving a process, thus reducing costs or providing customers with the best of class benefit. The selection of R&D projects is the most important of all the R&D management activities. Unless an R&D department is working on the right R&D projects, all its efforts should come to naught. A R&D strategy is important because it helps an R&D organization select projects in terms of a broader outlook rather than just bit by bit. When a R&D department has an overall strategy and has some strategic goals, it will more likely select projects that are in tune with its technical strengths, the capabilities of the company, and the demands of the marketplace. In order to develop a R&D strategy, certain prerequisites must be in place, such as belief in R&D strategy as a tool to solve problems, establishing a dedicated strategic planning group within the R&D department, and the top management's commitment to the R&D strategy. Some companies in India have made significant progress in developing a R&D strategy. Most companies, however, have barely started developing a R&D strategy. The immediate challenge facing most firms, therefore, has to do with first establishing the preconditions required for developing an R&D strategy. After doing this, they will then be able to meaningfully deal with issues as to what the R&D priorities should be and how R&D resources should be allocated.
You were listening to the audiobook by the School of Management Studies IGNOU for MBA program. Course code Mmpc 016 International Business Management. Course Coordinator Professor G. Subayama. Voiceover by Chitra. Edited by Savita. Program assisted by Tarannum Jahan and Jagbandhu Jana. Program produced by Dr. Manoj Kumar Singh. This program was brought to you by Electronic Media Production Center of Indira Gandhi National Open University.